We're 4 games into the UT season, and through 4 games, the Longhorns are undefeated. The best start since 2012 with a win over Alabama in week 2. The Longhorns have flown up the rankings up to number 3, and it's going to be hard to move them out of that spot given the current landscape. In fact, they might have the possibility to move up if this continues. How, as we sit here today, are the Longhorns a playoff team in your mind?
Yes. Yes, they are. Congratulations, Juju. They did it. Texas has rebuilt the plane in the sky. After losing to Kansas 2 years ago, they have spent the money. They have created the sham NIL funds that are funneling money to the players, which is a good thing, but I'm just saying they have a lot of money. Texas has spent the money. They have gone through the recruiting cycle, and now at the end of it all, they have a team that will run through the terrible, terrible Big 12, and on the end of it, emerge as a college football playoff team. Because Texas has done the hard part. They have beaten Alabama at Alabama. They are number 3 in the country. They're 4-0. They have 2 ranked opponents left on their schedule. It's this week against Kansas, who's ranked 24 in the country, and I think they're 17-point favorites. It's Red River against Oklahoma, and a third game will be whoever makes the Big 12 championship game. So Texas is in a fine position to make the college football playoff as long as they don't do the thing that Texas usually does, which is lose at TCU or at Houston or at Iowa State or some weird shit like that. As long as they take care of business, they will make the college football playoff.
For me, it doesn't come down to the talent on the field. It doesn't come down to the schematics. It's all mental with Texas, because we've seen this over the last couple of years where even in the rebuild, right, they were still more talented than a lot of the teams they lost to. You mentioned the Kansas loss. Even in that loss, which they play Kansas this week, they were more talented than Kansas. They should have not lost that game. Last year, I think they dropped to Texas Tech. They should have not lost that game. Some of the other losses over the last couple of years, Oklahoma State, when Quinn Ewers went out on the road and looked terrible, they shouldn't have lost that. Hell, even TCU, even though TCU made it to the national championship last year, they should have not lost to TCU last year. So, part of me, and it's more the like cynical side of me, I just look at the rest of the schedule. I'm like, okay, where's the dumb loss happening? Is it Iowa State? Is it Iowa State that's going to beat us? Or is it, again, Oklahoma State? Like, are we just going to go out on the road and that's going to be what it is? But this year's Texas team, I mean, I think the reason I look at them a little differently is they're built different. And what I mean by that is the last couple of versions of the Texas, we looked at them as an offensive powerhouse, right? But that's not what this year's Texas team is. If this year's Texas team is going to do anything historic, they're going to do it with their defense. Like, there's a lot to like about like guys who are definitely going to be playing on Sundays, like a Tavondre Sweat. You look in the linebacking core with a Jalen Ford, that guy's a stud. Anthony Hill, who's a freshman, is looking really good as a freshman linebacker. These are the players to keep an eye on. You lose Bijan Robinson and you're thinking, oh boy, how am we going to replace that guy? Especially with what he's doing with the Falcons this year. That guy's amazing. But they still found a way to like find some talented running backs. CJ Baxter, Jonathan Brooks had big games in the game against Baylor. They're going to be the focal point of the offense to make it easy for Quinn Ewers, because Quinn Ewers, I still have question marks on him. I know he's talented. I think he was like the highest graded prospect coming out of high school, but there's just some games, like even the Wyoming game, people like looked at the first 3 quarters and like, is this the guy that's going to lead us to the national title? Wyoming, certainly not a defensive powerhouse. Kansas, a lot better. Oklahoma, a lot better. Any of the Big 12 teams are better than what Wyoming was. So that's why I just have like question marks still about this team.
So Texas is in what I like to affectionately call Notre Dame purgatory. What Notre Dame purgatory is that you are a like tier 2 or tier 3 program right now as things exist. And every year, if you go 12-0 or 11-1 or 12-1 if you play in a conference championship game, you get a solid shot at making the college football playoff. Think about how we think of Notre Dame whenever they make the playoff. They go 12-0, but they never played anyone who was super tough, or maybe they played one tough opponent that they beat, and then they went 12-0, made it to the playoffs and got like their ass handed to them by Alabama, or made it to the playoff and got their ass handed to them by Ohio State. That's where Texas is right now, a tier 2 or tier 3 program that if they just take care of business every week, will get to the college football playoff or have a shot at making the college football playoff. The good thing about this year in college football is that if we're playing the numbers game, 2 or 3 Notre Dame purgatory teams are going to make the college football playoff, because in past years, everyone used to say it's always Alabama, Ohio State, and Clemson in the playoffs. And then they said it's always Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State in the playoffs. And then they always said it's always Georgia, Alabama, and Michigan in the playoffs. This year, there's only one of those teams. It's Georgia. Everyone else is kind of about the same. Think about it this also. Ohio State just played Notre Dame this weekend. That game came down to the last play of the game, the very last play where Ohio State scored a touchdown. This week, Ohio State is 4, Notre Dame is 11. Texas played Alabama. Texas was a better team than Alabama, but you feel like if they played that game 10 times, Texas would win 5 and Bama would win 5, or Texas would win 6 and Bama would win 4.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? Yeah.
Well, when I look at the top teams, like if we do get into the point of like them reaching the college football playoff, I still think that they would like out tough a team like Ohio State. When I look at what Michigan's done against Ohio State the last couple years, I think Texas would still be able to push them around, because I do think that Texas has some big boys this year in the trenches. And I think that that's going to like be a difference maker in a potential matchup of that. The softer like Pac-12 schools, I think are going to provide some unique challenges, but I think Texas still has those. When you mention them and kind of like in that tier, like with like a Michigan, for example, Michigan's been there, done that at least the last couple of years. And Michigan, depending on like JJ McCarthy at least has like the experience of being there the last couple of years. That experience is going to come in handy if like it comes down to, let's say Texas does hold the 3 all year and you get into that 2-3 matchup. I think JJ McCarthy might be a little bit of a difference maker, because again, with Quinn, it's just going to be all mental. I know this guy is one of the most talented quarterbacks in college football right now, a well-deserving NFL prospect. But when I saw him like shrink in a couple games last year, it makes me wonder how like that big stage would affect him when the bright lights really start coming on. Now, he showed up against Alabama, but it wasn't the first time he played Alabama. 2 years of playing Alabama. Michigan's a different animal. Georgia's certainly a different animal, but I would love if they did play Georgia again to see, does Uga still hold a grudge against Bevo? That's still a good TBD.
So the thing that Texas and also Florida State have going for them is that their toughest games are out of the way at this point. Like the games that were like the trap games for those two teams are done at this point. Like Texas beat Alabama, Florida State beat Clemson, Florida State beat LSU. Those Florida State still has to play, I think, Miami at home later in the season and like go to Florida. But like for the most part, Florida State should be favored in every game they play the rest of the season by a touchdown. Texas should be favored in every game they play the rest of the season by a touchdown. Those two teams are in a position where as long as you take care of business, you will have a crack at the playoff. And that's nice because Penn State is at number 7 right now. Well, Penn State has to play at Ohio State and home against Michigan. That's a tough stretch for them. Ohio State and Michigan have to play each other. And like the last 4 years, the winner of that game has gone to the playoff and the loser goes to whatever the secondary bowl game is. So that game is essentially quarterfinal.
Let me ask you about the dying days of the Pac-12. I mean, Caleb Williams, especially with all the Heisman hype, you have to figure that like voters are going to be more inclined, depending on how their season shakes out, to kind of give them a little bit of a bump. And even the Pac-12 in general, it's looking like a great quarterback conference. I mean, Bo Nix going off, Michael Penix Jr.'s elevated himself, potentially being in the first round. Colorado, we know they got their ass kicked by Oregon this week, but Colorado being good this year. Utah is in the top 10 still. We almost forget about Utah, but they're still silently one of the better teams in college football. The Pac-12 is interesting, and I think that kind of makes it another dynamic for Texas. Like, let's say they do drop one game. Again, nightmare situations, they drop a game, but let's just say they drop one game but beat the important games. They beat Kansas, they beat Oklahoma. Does an undefeated Pac-12 team like challenge them?
Oh, for sure. An undefeated Pac-12 team who wins the conference championship is the number 2 seed, no question. The interesting part is the one-loss Pac-12 champion. Where does that fit into the whole game here? In terms of the Pac-12 teams themselves, this year's USC team is not as good as last year's USC team. And last year's USC team was a Pac-12 championship win away from making the college football playoff as the 4th team. This year's USC team is not as good as last year's team. So I don't think USC will stay the course as they have so far. Personally, I think the best chance of the Pac-12 putting a team in the playoff is Washington. Like if Washington doesn't get beat up by the gauntlet of a Pac-12 schedule where they have to play Oregon and I think they play at USC too this year, maybe USC goes to them. It's one of the two. USC plays Washington at some point. They have to play Oregon. They have to play Oregon State. Like if Washington doesn't get beat up by the gauntlet of the Pac-12, I think they're the best chance in the conference to make the playoff. But I don't think any of the Pac-12 teams I would point to and say on paper they're the 5 most talented teams in college football. I think I'm looking at Georgia, clear cut number 1, no question. Then you have Michigan, Texas, Florida State, Ohio State. Like those 5 teams I feel like are the most talented on paper. And the thing that, again, Florida State and Texas have going for them is that the toughest part of their schedule is essentially out of the way. They'll be at least a touchdown favorite in every game they play the rest of the season, except for maybe the conference championship game on a neutral field. But I mean, for the most part, as long as those teams take care of business, as long as one of the teams shits the bed, I think even a 1-loss conference champion Texas can get into the playoff. And I don't know if that's the case for Florida State, but again, it's just a numbers game. Does the Pac-12 put together a 1-loss conference champion? Does the Big 12 put together a 1-loss conference championship? Does Florida State go undefeated and win the conference championship? Like, it's just a numbers game at the end of the day, and we'll see who emerges at the end.
And even if this year's Alabama team isn't as good as past year's versions of Alabama, I still think the voters are going to look at that Alabama win and give Texas a lot more love than they would have, because it just so ingrained in us to just think Alabama is amongst the elite of the elite. And that's, again, why I mentioned going back to USC with Caleb Williams. You add in like Heisman hype. I mean, at the end of the day, the people that are picking these polls are still just humans deciding on who goes out of these 4 teams, depending on narratives and storylines. I feel as though voters want Texas to be in there for sure. Talk about ratings on ratings, right?
I mean, the voters have made it clear in the past that ratings is less important to them. But in recent years, usually there's not much of a debate when it comes to who the 4 teams are. It's just a matter of where the seeding ends up. Like at the end, we will know who the 4 teams are pretty clear cut. But again, it's all just going to be a numbers game at the end. And Texas is in the best positioning of any of those teams.
So opening line, they play Georgia today. Where do you think it's at?
Georgia is like a 9.5 point favorite, like 9.5 probably.
The problem with Georgia, and this is just going to get pointed out, we know how good they are, obviously, right? They have all the 5 stars, the 4 stars, whatever it is, but their schedule doesn't exactly allow us a lot of opportunity to really test them out. So I want to see like Georgia in their first like real game. All right, guys. Well, UT, how you feeling about it? 4-0 through the season's early going. Again, best start since 2012. Is this team a real title contender? Is this team a lock for the college football playoff? Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on all our social medias from Juju and Kyle. Stay safe, happy, and healthy. We'll see you next time.